Racist officer disrespects black man, then learns he's the new police chief. A newly appointed police chief decides to go undercover at his own precinct, eager to observe his officers without the filter of introductions or formalities. But when a white officer disrespects him, assuming he's just a nobody, the entire department is moments away from a revelation that will shake them to their core. It was a humid Wednesday morning in early September when Marcus Reynolds, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in Fairview, a mid-sized city in Tennessee. Dressed in a faded t-shirt, worn-out jeans, and a pair of old sneakers, he looked more like a man running errands than someone who had spent over 2 decades rising through the ranks of law enforcement. That was exactly the point. Marcus believed in understanding his department for what it truly was, not through polished meetings and scripted greetings. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a precinct with a long history of internal complaints, he wanted to see the reality of the officers he was about to command. Would they treat him with the respect they claimed to uphold, or would their prejudices surface the moment they thought no one was watching? The parking lot was bustling with officers arriving for their shifts. Marcus took in the scene, noticing their body language, their interactions. No one recognized him, yet his appointment had been announced just a week ago, and he had deliberately kept his arrival unpublicized. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and walked toward the side entrance of the precinct. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and sweat. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the tiled floors. Officers gathered in groups near their desks, some chatting, others reviewing paperwork. No one even looked in his direction. That changed when he approached the break room. "Hey, you!" A sharp voice cut through the noise. Marcus turned, coming face to face with a broad-shouldered white officer in his late 30s. His badge read Officer Grayson. Behind him, a few other officers leaned against the wall, their expressions filled with curiosity and amusement. Grayson smirked. "You lost or something? This ain't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." Marcus froze. The words hit him like a slap, but he stayed quiet. He needed to see just how far this would go. Before he could speak, Grayson stepped closer, puffing out his chest. "Didn't you hear me? I said get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. One officer elbowed another, shaking his head. Marcus inhaled slowly, keeping his posture relaxed even as his pulse quickened. He could have shut this down immediately, but he wanted to see how deep the... Grayson wasn't done. He stepped in even closer, his voice dripping with arrogance. "People like you always find a way to loiter where you're not wanted." And then, without warning, Grayson spat in Marcus's face. Time seemed to stop. A cold silence replaced the laughter. Marcus's breath hitched as the warm saliva slid down his cheek. Around him, the other officers chuckled, nudging each other as if this were just another joke at someone else's expense. Marcus didn't react immediately. He refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief and wiped his face, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he looked straight into Grayson's eyes. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The group of officers burst into laughter again. Marcus didn't blink. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the space between them. The laughter began to fade as something in his stance shifted, an unshakable authority settling in. "Well, Officer Grayson, it looks like we have a problem, because as of this morning, I do belong here." Grayson's smirk wavered. "What are you talking about?" Marcus reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a golden badge. With a flick of his wrist, he flipped it open, revealing his name, his title, and his rank. Marcus Reynolds, Chief of Police. The room fell into dead silence. Grayson's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly before snapping shut, his confidence crumbling right in front of everyone. The officers who had been laughing just seconds ago suddenly looked anywhere but at Marcus. Marcus let the moment stretch, watching as reality crashed down on them. Then he spoke again, low, steady and final. "And now, Officer Grayson, let me ask you something. Do you still think I don't belong here?" Grayson swallowed hard, his lips pressing together. Marcus gave him a small, knowing nod. "That's what I thought." Then, with all eyes on him, he turned and walked down the hallway, not as a stranger, not as a target, but as the man who now controlled all of their futures. This was no longer just a department. The intercom crackled overhead, calling all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as officers filed in, some clutching steaming cups of coffee, others laughing over inside jokes. Officer Grayson, still riding the high of his morning encounter, leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, wearing a smug expression. The room was alive with chatter, unaware of what was about to unfold. Through a side entrance, Marcus stepped in, now holding a folder bearing the precinct's official seal. He remained in the shadows for a moment, watching the officers, some of whom had laughed at him just an hour early, completely unaware of his presence. Captain Harris, a stocky man in his late 50s with a graying moustache, stood at the front of the room, his voice booming over the noise. "All right, settle down," Harris called, waving a hand. "We've got an important introduction today." The room quieted, curiosity flickering in the officer's eyes. "As most of you know, Chief Halstead retired last month. We've been awaiting his replacement, and today I'm pleased to introduce our new leader." He glanced at the folder Marcus held. A man with an impressive record and a clear vision for this department. The room stilled as Marcus stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate. Conversations died mid-sentence. The light above the podium illuminated his face as he placed the folder on the lectern and took a slow, calculated scan of the crowd. Recognition dawned on Grayson's face, first this smug smirk disappearing in an instant, replaced by a sickly shade of pale. Whispers rippled through the room, some officers shifting uncomfortably, others frozen in their seats, eyes wide. Marcus let the tension settle before speaking. "Good morning." His voice was steady, commanding. "My name is Marcus Reynolds. As of today, I am your new chief of police." Silence. Marcus's eyes found Grayson, holding his gaze a fraction longer than the others before sweeping across the room. He could see the weight of realization sinking in, the stunned expressions, the embarrassed glances exchanged. "When I arrived this morning," Marcus continued, his voice even, "I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. What I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur spread through the crowd, but Marcus raised a hand, immediately silencing them. "In my brief time here, I've already seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional but outright unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear: the culture allowed to fester here ends today." A heavy stillness settled over the room. Grayson's shoulders twitched, his arms no longer crossed as confidently as before. Beads of sweat formed at his temple as he stared at the floor. Marcus took a measured step closer to the edge of the podium, his gaze sharp. "Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail not just each other, but the community we are sworn to serve." The officers sat stiffly, some shifting under his piercing stare. "This morning," Marcus continued, his tone cutting, "some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through these doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not." A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. Marcus let the weight of his words linger before he stepped down from the podium, walking slowly toward the officers. His presence was towering not in size, but in authority. The officer flinched. "Officer Grayson," Marcus said, his voice controlled but lethal. The room held its breath. Grayson swallowed, the cocky persona from earlier gone, replaced by sheer panic. "You," Marcus continued, locking eyes with him, "represent everything broken in this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, the people of this city. Grayson opened his mouth, his voice shaky. Chief, too didn't know. That's exactly the problem. Marcus cut him off, his voice sharp, unwavering. You didn't care to know. You saw a man who didn't look like you, who didn't fit your expectations of power, and you thought it was your right to humiliate him. A long pause. Marcus stepped even closer, Grayson now looking like a man who wished he could disappear into the floor. This department is about to change, Marcus stated plainly. And you, Officer Grayson, are going to be the first example. He turned back toward the podium. I expect your resignation by the end of today. Gasps echoed through the room. A few officers exchanged nervous glances, while others remained motionless. Grayson visibly deflated, his once proud stance shrinking into one of defeat. Marcus scanned the room once more before clasping his hands behind his back. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about setting a standard. This department will be built on integrity and respect, and for those of you who cannot uphold that standard, I suggest you leave now. He let the words hang in the air. Then, without another glance at Grayson, he strode out of the room, his message seared into every officer's mind. Change wasn't coming. It had already arrived. Marcus Reynolds didn't take his eyes off Grayson, his expression unwavering. You didn't take a second to think before you acted, Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. You assumed that the man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption, that exact mindset is why this department has lost the trust of the very people it's sworn to protect. The room remained deathly silent. Every officer stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would shape the future of the precinct. Marcus turned to the rest of the officers, his gaze sweeping across the room, addressing them all now, not just Grayson. What I witnessed today wasn't just one man's mistake, he continued. It was a symptom of a larger problem. A culture that allows bullying, prejudice, and unchecked arrogance to thrive. And let me make this clear, that ends now. He took a step toward the podium, his voice rising just enough to let the weight of his words settle in. I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets, but within the walls of departments like this one. Change isn't easy. It won't happen overnight. But let me promise you this, as long as I am chief, this precinct will operate under 3 principles: integrity, respect, and accountability. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Some officers looked at their feet, avoiding his stare. Others stood rigid, their expressions unreadable. Marcus paused, letting the silence sink in before he gave a small nod toward Captain Harris. Effective immediately, Officer Grayson is suspended, pending an internal investigation. Gasps echoed through the room. Grayson's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he clenched his fists at his sides. His once smug demeanor had been completely shattered. Marcus didn't flinch. He remained standing tall. This isn't about punishment, he said, his tone unwavering. It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to meet it, he let his eyes drift across the room, making contact with several officers, then this isn't the place for you. A tense silence followed. Officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some nodding almost imperceptibly, others looking away. Marcus exhaled slowly, then delivered his final words with precision. If you are ready to do better, to be better, then we will move forward. Together. But understand this. I will hold you accountable. Every step of the way. The meeting ended with a thick, weighted silence. Officers shuffled out of the room, but there was no laughter this time. No murmured jokes. No casual chatter. Marcus remained at the podium, watching as Grayson stormed out, his face a mix of embarrassment, resentment, and anger. The other officers carefully avoided making eye contact, their expressions ranging from guilt to quiet contemplation. Back in his office, Marcus sat at his desk, letting out a slow, steady breath. He knew this was just the beginning. Years of ingrained habits and attitudes wouldn't change overnight. For some, they might never change at all. But he hadn't come to Fairview to make friends. He had come to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up. Captain Harris's voice came through the receiver. "Chief," Harris said, his voice hesitant but sincere, "I just wanted to say you handled that better than most would have." Marcus nodded, though Harris couldn't see him. "Thanks, Captain," he replied. "But the real work starts now. I need a full review of Grayson's history on my desk by tomorrow." Complaints, incident reports, everything. A pause. "You got it," Harris said. Then, after a hesitation, he added, "Chief, I think you shook a few of them today." "A beat." "In a good way." Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply nodded to himself, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Then he turned back to the stack of reports sitting on his desk, knowing this was only the first step. Over the next few weeks, the precinct changed. Officers who once laughed at Grayson's antics now avoided him entirely. The whispers of his suspension spread quickly, rippling through the department like a storm. Marcus made it a point to walk the halls regularly, greeting officers, engaging in conversation, his presence a constant reminder of his leadership. Some officers took the shift in culture to heart. Officer Reyes, a young recruit, approached him one day, hesitation in her eyes. "Chief," she said cautiously, "I wanted to say I know I've been complicit in all this. I let it happen because I was afraid of retaliation. But I want to do better." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's all I ask," he said, his tone firm but kind. "It starts with you." Not everyone, however, was willing to change. Grayson filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. Marcus held firm. The department's internal review uncovered a long history of complaints against Grayson, ranging from excessive force to inappropriate comments. His appeal was denied, and Marcus made it clear the days of brushing misconduct under the rug were over. Despite the progress, Marcus knew the road ahead would be long. Conversations about bias and accountability were met with mixed reactions. Some officers were receptive, others resisted. But Marcus remained undeterred. Each small victory, a recruit speaking up, an officer rethinking their approach, was another step in the right direction. One morning, Marcus attended a community meeting, knowing this was the next battle. But as he stepped into the crowded room, he felt something different. Hope. It was happening. At a community event in Fairview, Marcus Reynolds was approached by a young boy, no older than 10, who hesitated before speaking. His small hands fidgeted as he finally asked, "Are you really the chief?" Marcus knelt down so they were at eye level and offered a reassuring smile. "I am." "What's your name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Jalen." His voice dropped to a whisper. "My dad says the police don't care about us." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He exhaled slowly before replying, his tone gentle but firm. "I can't change the past, Jalen. But I promise you, we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me. Okay?" Jalen's eyes searched Marcus's face for a moment, before he finally nodded. A small, hopeful smile formed on his lips. Moments like these reminded Marcus why he took this job. By the end of his first year, the Fairview precinct wasn't perfect, but it was undeniably different. Officers resistant to change had been replaced with recruits who believed in integrity and respect. The community, once skeptical, began to take notice slowly. Trust was being rebuilt. One evening, Marcus stood in the precinct's main hallway, watching as officers finished their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie felt different now, not at someone's expense, but genuine and inclusive. Change wasn't easy, but for the first time Marcus knew it was worth it. Lesson from the story. The power of accountability and change. In life, we often witness injustice, whether in workplaces, communities, or personal interactions. This story teaches us that change starts with accountability not just for others, but for ourselves. Leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. If you find yourself in a toxic environment, don't accept it as the norm. Challenge unfair practices. Speak up when something is wrong. Like Marcus, real leaders don't just punish mistakes, they create cultures where people want to do better. For those in positions of authority, remember, respect is not given because of a title, it's earned through actions. Treat others with dignity regardless of status, race, or background. For communities, rebuilding trust takes time, but small actions matter. A kind word, an open conversation, and a willingness to listen can transform relationships. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if we hold ourselves and others accountable, we can create a world where fairness, respect, and justice aren't just ideals, but everyday realities.